I think we're good. No worries. Sure. I just let these guys finish sleeping and we're good to go. What time do you think? Dave Sabina. I'm with New Corporation. This is a course we've been running since our inception in 2000. It's been updated quite a bit lately due to a number of CRA changes. So those of you who might have gone through in the past, hopefully we'll find something new. What we typically do is spend about an hour and a half dealing with the technical elements, with the eligibility from an SR&ED perspective. And then we spend typically about an hour and a half dealing with the financial tax and cost issues related. In this course, due to the recent changes, we're probably going to spend about 2 hours on the technical part, and then we're going to skim through the financial issues in an hour. So we're going to focus on some of the new changes and new pronouncements. Typically, what happens is, in an SR&ED claim, you'll have teams of people that come together and try to work together to document the project. So if it's just one person documenting the project, it tends to be a simpler process than when we get larger companies and teams of people. So we'll talk only about the technical requirements, but some of the strategies to do that. First, we'll look at a quick overview of the SR&ED rules themselves. The amounts that are handed out each year are roughly $6 billion, but recent budget changes have reduced this substantially. So the numbers are somewhere, including the provinces, between $4 to $6 billion per year. Quebec, as a province, makes up more than 50% of the total provincial funding. We have some interesting methods and techniques to hand out their credits and to evaluate what kinds of work are strategic for Quebec. So we'll talk about that a little later. Very quickly, in 2007, the government Department of Finance produced a study that talked about the number of claimants and the breakdown. Basically, in 2004, which are the latest stats, there was around $3.4 billion federally handed out that year, of which two-thirds of the money, just over two-thirds of the money, went to large public companies or foreign companies, what we call the 20% non-refundable clients. We'll talk a little bit more about what that means later in the course. And roughly a third of the money, or just under a third, went to the Canadian-controlled private corporations, or what we call the qualified corporations. So roughly 4,000 large companies or analysis, university or academic level SR&ED. So they use the word technological advancement. It contemplates technological advancement for the purpose of creating new or improving existing materials, devices, products, or processes, they say, including incremental improvements there too. So they're a little redundant, but they say you could be creating a new product or process, or incrementally improving an existing product or process. In fact, the tax courts have said that most advancements or improvements under SR&ED are infinitesimally small incremental improvements to existing products or processes. That spectacular breakthroughs are rare are the terms that they use. So, what I start to do to explain this portion of the Act to people is I use this little brochure that anyone got the handle have in the front there. And this really contains what I believe is everything you need to know on a technology basis to determine if you're eligible. Right now we're on the very back, not because it's the least important, but if I put the Income Tax Act in front of people at the start, it'll start to freeze up. So the Act says that we need technological advancement, and then they go on to specify 7 to 8 types of specific activities that they say, if they're necessary, what the terms they use are commensurate with the needs of the project, which basically means that they're necessary to resolve one of the pre-stated technology problems or uncertainties. And we'll talk about what that means by examples. They're saying any of these activities, any engineering, operations research, mathematical analysis that you do would be in. Those are the parts that people, if I ask someone with no training on R&D tax credits, what do you think that your R&D was? Intuitively, those are the things they would tend to tell you. And they would be correct. As we get on the list, there's other activities that they might not think of as SR&D or they might not recognize immediately. Any computer programming that I do in order to answer a question, to resolve a problem, should be in. The question is, can I make the link that I need to do that programming or not? Any data gathering that I do from the point I define a problem in order to answer that problem would be in. It's very important that I define the problems as early as possible and correlate that work to it. And probably the big one here is testing. So anything that I can argue is testing to see if, in fact, the objectives have been met and my understandings or hypothesis are correct or incorrect is in. And that can encompass a large amount of work depending on how you define it. The last one that's listed in the Act, and it's a bit of an ambiguity, is psychological research. So they put it in the Act, and then we'll watch in the next section, they pull it back out again as a social science. And psychological research is a very tricky one. It's really restricted to the pharmaceutical field, where they're at the final stage of testing of a drug, and they've gone through cats and dogs and monkeys and stuff for probably 15 years. And finally, they test on humans. And at that point, they do psychological testing as well as all the biological and chemical testing, which the CRA believes is integral to the development. But in most other fields, like software, if you try to make something more intuitive, none of those are going to fly. They're going to say that part is a social science. So psychological research is one of those really tricky ones in the Act that it could be in or it could be out, more depending on what field you're working on than anything else. Okay? The Act currently, right now, goes on to provide a list of things that are not SR&ED. And there's a lot of talk that these don't need to be in the Act. They could be removed from the Act because arguably they're not, most of them are not really issues. They're more examples of things that don't fit in the first part. So commercial production is production of a product after we appear to have resolved the uncertainty. So at every point of an SR&ED project that becomes successful, there's a point of experimental production where we still have existing uncertainties that aren't resolved. Once we've hit our relevant sample sizes and tolerances and confidence intervals, we decide the project's closed and we know how to do it. Now we've gone into the commercial production stage where there don't appear to be any significant uncertainties left. And that it's up to the client. The CRA says it's up to the client or the claimant to define when they think they've reached that point of commercial versus experimental production. Quality control is taking every 1,000th widget off the line and collecting data on it without aiming at pre-stated uncertainty, really just to make sure all your machines are in calibration. So that in itself doesn't qualify. You have to correlate the work to a pre-stated uncertainty. We'll talk about research in the social sciences and humanities, but they include things like accounting, business studies, marketing, finance, economics, will people buy it type issues. None of those are really going to fly. Psychology is another one, so that's the totter. Anything that we can't measure, what they say is an aesthetic or style change, things that can't be quantified. Does that color of paint look nice? Or does it look clean? Or does it look fair? Would not be an eligible way to rate it if I was a paint developer. But if I was to measure what's the chromography at different angles, under different light conditions and things like that, that would be systematic. So measurement becomes incredibly important in an SR&ED project. Tax courts, in fact, say that systematic investigation involves extremely accurate measurements and analysis of those measurements. I say, without such measurement and analysis, systematic investigation cannot exist. So the quantification part is stressed, I'd say, more by the tax courts than the Canada Revenue Agency itself. And probably one of the most important ones is there's a deadline now of 18 months for a corporation to file. Technically, a corporation's tax return is due 6 months from year end, and that's where the CRA likes to see it filed. That's where I would advise it to be filed. And if you don't file in time, or if you don't file in time, that's fine, as long as you file the SR&ED return with the tax return together within the 18 months, the CRA is more or less happy about that. If you file a tax return and then amend it later to file an SR&ED return, it's your right to file or amend the return within the 18 months. But then you go through a more rigorous review standard. We'll talk in your notes, and I won't get into this much, but we also look at how the IRS defines a project description. And really they follow the same criteria. They use slightly different terms, but they would map to kind of an internet template, as we call it. The eligible fields of research, then, are defined OECD. So we took our definition from this group called the Frascati Manual. The Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development lists these fields of science, and if you look at our groupings, we followed them exactly. We use the same names, same numbers, same groupings. It's verbatim, a complete copy of groupings. So basically break it into your eligible fields, your natural sciences, chemistry, biology, things like that, engineering and technology, medical and health sciences, and agricultural. The ineligible science being your social sciences and humanities. All right. One of the big changes. In December of 2012, the Canada Revenue Agency released its what they call consolidated policy paper. What it is actually a series of papers on different issues that they have consolidated on a page, and it replaces a series of other documents with about a 25-year lifespan. Interpretation bulletins, information circulars, and what they call application policy papers. The Canada Revenue Agency stresses that they don't represent any change in policy. They're just clarifying issues and removing ambiguities. They have also released additional manuals for technology reviewers and financial reviewers. Okay. So now that we've talked about the Income Tax Act, basic research, applied research, experimental, people are saying, well, that's kind of interesting, Dave, but if I want to get a credit, what is it I need to tax return so that the government gives me the money? I don't want to waste any time. I just want to spend the minimum amount of time and get my maximum value back. So to say what the Act tells us is we have to show that we've got technological advancement. And that's pretty much the only term in the Act that we've got to follow. How do we show we've got technological advancement? Well, we'll look to the CRA. And CRA says, well, what we want you to do is we want you to submit project descriptions and they go on a basis that every company follows something called an activity project program hierarchy, whether they know it or not. Program tends to be ongoing. I might have a cost reduction program. I'm trying to reduce the cost. What the CRA would say is, but you could for a cost reduction project. A project typically has objectives that are achievable within 3 years or less. So I make this device for $100 a unit right now, and my objective is within the next 2 years, I want to get it to 97 profit. They say, that's great. So that's the SR&ED project, cost reduction project, within my cost reduction program. The point being, needs an actual or estimated completion date. If you don't put that in, it's going to get rejected, guaranteed. So that the CRA recommendations, a project is a set of interrelated activities being what you actually do, that collectively, they say, attempt the technological advancement. Right? So they're using the Income Tax Act term right here. And I would argue it's not the best description. It doesn't solicit what they really want from people when you look at what they want to see coming, which requires them to overcome technologically pursued what they call systematically by qualified individuals. All right? So we're going to talk about what each of those three things means. So again, on your brochure here, if anyone's watching along the brochure, or page B20 for those of you who are following in the course. The first thing that I like to do is call it thinking outside the box. An SR&ED project should be thinking outside the box. In order to show I'm thinking outside the box, the obvious first step is first I have to define the boundaries of the box. What is the existing knowledge? What are things that should be readily apparent to someone skilled in the art? Say, in the new policy papers, and it's pretty much the same concept, I'd say, as the old policy papers, the old information circular. But the wording's slightly different. They say, quote, the company is expected to have information that's common knowledge to professionals familiar with specific areas of science or technology. So if I say, well, this is an advancement to me software because I know nothing about software, I've actually just disqualified myself. They say if you have a Bachelor of Science or equivalent or a college diploma in that technology, you're usually deemed to be qualified. Without formal training, you see that a lot, they want to see a minimum 2 to 3 years industry experience, real knowledge of the field of science, before you can do that development. So it's not a training credit, it's actually an SR&ED credit for people who are properly trained in that field at a certain level and trying to expand the knowledge of that field. In the technology base or level they define, it says it refers to the existing level of technology and consists of knowledge, resources within the company, and sources available publicly. These include the knowledge of the existing personnel and contractors, current products, techniques, methodologies, trade secrets, and intellectual property. And the big one, and this is where a lot of claims now are falling short, is publicly available sources. So they list publications, journals, textbooks, internet-based expertise through employees or contractors. So what they're really saying here, if you read through what they want to get, they want you to tell them this work you did to find out what is available before you start. Which seems to make, I mean, as a business that makes good sense too. You don't want to go spend $100,000 on a project if you could find the solution on the internet and buy it for $10,000. So most companies do this kind of due diligence work ahead of doing a project, but they don't keep the right documentation, and that really becomes an issue. They then clarify that the technology base will vary from company to company, even though the knowledge publicly available remains the same. The old wording is they say it's related to the business context of the firm, but an enterprise may not have practical access to information that's proprietary to a competitor or known only in specialist or academic circles, was the old wording in the circular. And what they're saying is each company, based on its resources, is expected to do a reasonable search to find out what's out there. Now, what's reasonable? This is really where the judgment comes into play. What may be reasonable for you may not be for me, and vice versa. I would use rules of thumb, like on a $10 million project, I'd expect you to do a little more due diligence than a $10,000 project. But again, these are generalities. In reality, the $10 million project may be completely so advanced that there's really very little to look at, and the $10,000 project may have lots of standard practice. So again, the facts of each situation should really drive what's reasonable. There's no right or wrong. My rule of thumb is the more the better. The more you do, obviously the better. And if you've done it, you want to make the CLA aware of that. Okay? So how do you do it? Well, our recommendation is there's really 2 steps into this. We want to say, what are all the possible things that we could do to figure out what information. So the first 3 are really kind of the same. It's some kind of internet search. And as a result of the search, we grab X number of articles, or blogs or whatever. If you do patent searches, Google Patents or something like that, again, it's just really another internet search, but the CLA really likes that. and the IRS too, so if you do it, you want to mention it. What are the limits of the methods that you found for whatever you're trying to do within those sources? You want to look at competitors, and they'll say, hey, a competitor may have a method that's proprietary or a trade secret, and you're not expected to do anything illegal or immoral to do this, but you could reverse engineer it or say, hey, I recognize a competitor's done this, we don't know how to do it, we have to figure something out to be competitive. That's great. At least it gives the reviewer a benchmark of what's the environment that we're dealing with and what would be reasonable for the person to know starting out. Okay? Your own in-house technologies, particularly if you've got trade secrets or you're building on your own IP, that's a great indicator that you don't really have anyone else to look for because you're the driving force. You're already the person expanding the knowledge in that area. Buyers are often a great source to do it. They could tell the chemical that we're providing to behave the following way, or give you ideas on how to distribute it or use it in your processes. Probably the last one is what I call queries to experts, which could be anything from free information on a blog to a $1 million study that you commission and everything in between. And if you want other, but really people don't use that other. So the more things you do here, the better. There's no right or wrong, but if you leave this blank, that can become an issue. More and more, I'm finding the Canada Revenue Agency is not denying whole projects, but really kind of taking a project that would be 100% qualified before and whittling stuff off the front and the back. Questioning what's the actual starting date? When did we first define the uncertainty? And is any of this work included in the project or excluded from the project? Is it before the project started? So these kinds of issues are popping up more and more. The next thing I want to do to show that we've passed stage 1, thinking outside the box, so step 2 of stage 1 I call it, is tell us what are the objectives that we can't achieve based on the existing standard practice. So what do we think we can do? And ideally, let's quantify the performance requirements. So they could be cost, like I said, I'm at $100 a unit and I want to go to $95 a unit. It could be performance. I'm cutting this piece of metal to a 6 micron tolerance and I want to go to 4 micron tolerance. Any kind of measurable parameter, response time in software, anything that you can measure, we want to add them up here. We try to list at least the top 3 to 5. And the reality is, it's very seldom one single objective causes the problem. It's when you stack them all up together. You say, well, I could get this response time and I could use this memory usage, but not if I have to keep the cost to $100 a unit. For $1,000 a unit, no problem, but if I'm going to go to $100 a unit, I may not be able to use some of the techniques or measures or tools, which is when I add all these objectives together to try to achieve the combination of those objectives creates the technological uncertainty. So again, outlining what all of those objectives are and how they stack up to create the uncertainty. Once we've benchmarked standard practice, then gives the CLA reviewer or the tax court judge, depending what level we have to go to, the information they need to evaluate whether we're thinking outside the box or, what the Act would say, contemplating technological advancement. Okay, so a little proverb here is if you don't do this upfront work, which is usually a small amount, maybe 1% of the project, if you don't do it, or better yet, more often, you do it, but you don't keep any. I never knew I had to keep that. Why didn't you tell me to keep it? Remember, but I did. I looked at 40 articles. Try to go back. Try to recreate what you've done. There's something called a Google Wayback Engine that you can say, hey, you know, on February 20, 2011, I did this search, so there may be new stuff now, but it wasn't there. You can actually go back and figure out what you would have seen on February 2011. So there's all kinds of neat techniques you can do to really build that in. Okay, so let's assume we believe we have objectives beyond standard practice. We think we're thinking outside the box. The pivotal point of every project, and this is what the CLA now calls the project birth certificate, I like that term, or the initiation of the project, is when we define the first of the technological uncertainties. So generally speaking, the Canada Revenue say, well, you collect various data up to the point you define a technological uncertainty. So they say, quote, technological uncertainty can occur in either of 2 ways. There's scientific uncertainty, whether the given objective can be achieved at all, or system uncertainty. What alternatives, for instance, paths, approaches, equipment configurations, circuit techniques, system architectures, and so forth, will either work at all or be feasible to meet cost targets. So what they're saying is we know we can do it with unlimited time and money, but we don't know the optimal combination of these variables, the things under our control that we can do or change in order to achieve the objectives. They then put a lot of emphasis lately on the term hypothesis. It's brought out the hypothesis. What's the hypothesis? They say hypothesis means an idea consistent with the known facts. So we've got to go back to what do we do at the square at the due diligence level? Did we benchmark standard practice that serves as a starting point for further investigations to prove or disprove that idea? All right? So they're saying really what the CRA says is you can't evidence a project or advancement until you define the first of the uncertainties. And that's where the clock starts ticking on the costs. So the next question is, how do I evidence an uncertainty? And what we found is, and we'll talk about this a little more, is that pretty much every field of science has some kind of mathematical model as a hypothesis. We'll talk about the term hypothesis later. But ultimately, when we're talking about a hypothesis, we have a model to do something. And we believe it's the interrelation of certain variables. So the variables could be anything. They could be temperature versus pressure versus amount of fiber content in a mold, each of which could have a differing effect. And what we find is, if we only have one single variable, if the only variable that we're dealing with, maybe I'm doing heat treating, is just the temperature, what the Canada Agency would say is that's just fine-tuning. One variable is not technological uncertainty because you're going to get it. It may take you a while, but if you spend enough time, 100% certain, you should figure out what the setting is. It's like tuning a radio. If instead I say, well, there's system uncertainty because I don't know what the optimal temperature is till you tell me what pressure to use. So if I do 10 tests for temperature and 10 tests for pressure, at first it seems like I got 20 tests. But in reality, on my design of experiment or DOE model, I have 100 tests in my matrix, because for each of the first 10, I test 10 more. If I say, well, variable is the amount of fiber content in the mix, 10 more tests on that, now I have potentially 1,000 tests in my matrix. Which is why I like to say that 3 or more variables, where I can say, our SolidWorks modeling software, which tells us or predicts how the mold's going to go, it doesn't predict this one, because maybe this is a new material, or we're doing something different that wasn't modeled by the software. And those are great kind of evidence to me, because the software, maybe SolidWorks or something that's used by tens of thousands of clients around the world, is kind of the standard practice. They can predict most things about how the mold's going to work. But maybe you've created a situation that it can't. So we're, in fact, advancing the science, advancing the predictive capabilities of the existing algorithms that say the weightings of temperature and pressure have these relations, and you're saying, no, in this situation, it's different. And I'm going to understand that and advance that technology. So I'm finding that the best way to evidence a hypothesis is say, what variables are we sure of, or we already know in a model, and if we can apply that as standard practice or routine. If we say, I think that the variables that would normally work here are different in this situation, that's where we're in the realm of experimental development. It's when we define the first of these problems that the SR&ED project starts, what they call the birth certificate. So if I go back to my example, that at the square level, maybe I looked at 40 different competitive products to really figure out how something worked. So the question is, and maybe it took me a month to do that. Is any of that time eligible? How many people think it is? How many people think it's not? How many people think it might be? Well, I would say it might. The answer is, it depends when I define my uncertainty. If after the third or fourth product, I said, hey, you know what, I already know, I'm guaranteed we're going to have problems in these areas, temperature, pressure, whatever the case may be, and I'm still going to look at the other 37 to see how did those guys deal with it. Now, once I've defined the problem, the other 37 instances I'm looking at are data gathering related to testing a problem. That's all in. And what the CRA is going to do is they're going to ask for evidence of the date that I define the problem. Show me something. Did you send an email? Did you send a letter? How did you formally decide that February 7th was the date this project started? As soon as I can say, well, look, I realized here are the problems here. All my costs after February 7th to do that data collection would be in it. But until I define the problem, they would now argue all those due diligence costs up to the point where I can define the problem are pre-SR&ED. So again, you want to define the problem as soon as possible. Really important. I would argue even share that information with the team. Okay, so you want to define what is it that we know and what is it that we have to change. And make it clear. All right. I would argue those first two steps are the manager's job. We get the team together. Hey, Eureka, look at this new idea. It's like the KX10 project from last year, but different in some ways. Here's how it's the same. Here's how it's different. Here's what we expect the main variables that we're going to experiment with to be. So if we can get the team to agree, what are the things we can control that we're going to go and experiment or change in order to make this happen? Each individual can document his or her own activities. So they can go along and say, hey, you know what, these 4 prototypes I did, I think they helped me deal with the pressure or vibration issues that we're dealing with, or one or more of the problems that the team has said is an uncertainty to us. Okay? And if they document that, that's the kind of documentation that the COA is looking for. Real time, why did the work that I do correlate to the uncertainty? And that's the only link that we have to make. If the work that we did is necessary to resolve the pre-stated uncertainty, it's SR&ED. If it's not, it's out. All right, the last step. What do we need from the guy who does the work? Well, this is where the lion's share of the documentation takes place. That first 15 minutes where the team structures the project and talks about their due diligence is usually very quick. What we did really takes, could follow us through the year. And what we want to do is create a scenario where the Canada Revenue Agency reviewer can very quickly evaluate not only whether the work is SR&ED, but whether the costs that you're claiming appear plausible. And the best way that we found to do that, from looking at what clients are successful in claims and which ones are not, is to tell them how many alternatives you looked at and the method that you used to do it. And those two combinations, for someone skilled in that, will usually give them a good 300 man-hours or 3,000 man-hours or 30,000 man-hours. And the kinds of things that we're looking at are how many different alternatives did you look at and how did you do it? The quickest method is usually analysis or simulation. Oh, I took my software program and I simulated 1,200 alternatives using software, and it took 8 hours because software is going at the speed of light. So that's usually the quick part. And then typically what happens is you say, well, out of those 1,200 alternatives, we found 4 that look particularly promising theoretically, based on what our model says. So now we went on the shop floor and pulled the guys off the line and ripped the line apart and tried a bunch of tests and then put the line back together the way it's supposed to be at the start, so that we can go back to business. So each of those may take tens or hundreds of hours now because we're using physical thing, people, depending how big our line is. And then the next level is, we tried to tweak the existing line, add new material, add new functions or features to it, and that didn't work, but we got this idea that we'll redesign the complete line from scratch. We'll do everything differently. So that usually has a 3A and B. You have prototypes, and maybe on a $1 million or $2 million prototype, you have 20, 30, 40 revisions. So this is when you're tending to talk hundreds of thousands of hours. So again, what we want to do is we want a COA reviewer, put yourself in their shoes, to have enough information to say, yeah, I used to do this work 10 years ago when I was in industry, and I believe that 3,000 man-hours appears reasonable for what they did here. All right? So you want to put yourself in their shoes and say, how could I, without doing a site visit, have enough information to determine whether, in fact, there was experiments, we looked at alternatives, we didn't get to the right answer, and secondly, that the time and cost appear plausible. So that's really the most important step then. Once we have that, what we want to do is we want to compare any results. Did we achieve any of our objectives? So maybe my cost objective was, I want to go from $100 to $95, and maybe I went all the way to $85. I'm at 300% of my objective. I'd say, well, that's a really interesting result. Maybe I should conclude on that. How do I explain how I could be at 300? I didn't understand those variables as well as I thought of, or I wouldn't have been out that much. So that's a great conclusion. The farther you are from your objectives, I'm saying that's a basis to say, try to explain why do you think that happened or didn't happen. Okay? So there was the conclusions. All right? And so, year 29 of your handouts, they say that systematic investigation or search is an approach that includes defining the problem, so advancing a hypothesis towards resolving it, a triangle level, planning and testing the hypothesis by experiment or analysis, and developing logical conclusions based on the results. Okay, so I have a result. Is it what I expected or is it not what I expected? And if it's what I expected, great. It confirms my hypothesis is correct. Or better yet, hey, it's different than what I expected. Let's try to explain how is my hypothesis wrong. Because they'll say that proving a hypothesis is incorrect represents a technological advance. In fact, it's the conclusion at the end of the day that represents the advance, not the results. And that's what a lot of people think. Hey, my product worked, I hit my expectations, the client's happy, we're off to the races. That's not a technological advancement, that's only a business advancement. So if we only bring it to the results and we quit right at the finish line, we talk about what results we had but not what we learned, that's where the problem's going to fall. And I see a lot of clients do this. They bring it almost there, but then they just don't close that last loop. Right? This is a real issue that when you go back a year or two instead of documenting this real time, it's often hard for people to remember all the blind alleys, that they remember the final solution. They don't want to talk about or even relive all their nightmarish things. So again, documenting things real time is often the best way to do it, because again, when you try to get employees rather than owners to talk about their SR&ED, they're often leery to do that. They don't want to show you all the quote-unquote stupid things that they tried, because in retrospect, they should have thought of this 20 years ago, would be their opinion. Why do I want to show the boss how I wasted the company's money? So again, you want to change the culture of that mindset. Okay? Putting it all together then, what we want to do in a project description, this is the template that we're going to use to evaluate all the CLA projects, and the recommended template for doing a project is, how do we benchmark existing technology? Will there be limits to someone's? How do we show that our objectives and standard practice and meet the court's required quantification and extremely accurate measurements? The best way to quantify and figure out where we fall short. To show the hypothesis, what I found is that in every field, there's algorithms and models that predict how something works. Y plus 2Z is the issue. If it's medicine, they'll look at different variables with someone's age, sex, weight, blood type, whatever. And do these variables have an effect or not? Yes or no? X, Y, Z, W, you can call them whatever you want. But they're always looking at variables and trying to figure out which variables are more significant and which ones are less significant. This is the key part that the manager or the team have to do together, and then each individual investigator we recommend could document his or her own activities. Once they have the framework to ask themselves, is my work aiming at resolving one of the variables of uncertainty or not, it's usually a clear directive, so those people now know what to do. And if the people know what to do, they'll usually give you great information back. It's where you try to go a year back and write a description of what happened in the last 12 to 18 months that all the problems start to happen. Okay? So again, I want to reiterate that a lot of the advancements in certain fields are infinitesimally small, incremental improvements is what the tax court says, to existing products or processes. You don't have to be 10% better, 1% better as your objective, as long as it aims at resolving technological uncertainty. Okay. With the new policy release particular stood out, and that's the definition of eligibility for SR&ED. So the rest of the papers deal with financial issues, and I would say that they're relatively consistent with the old papers. This paper, although it says it's no change to the existing policy, there are some potential changes that we'll talk about, or interpretive changes, I would say, that they're starting to formalize. So the consolidated document talks about different things, and we're going to talk about the scope of it, looking at the role of the tax court versus an expert witness. What does the judge say RTA should tell the court? And in fact, that you'll see that the judge tells the COA that it's not up to the Canada Revenue Agency reviewer or RTA to decide whether it's SR&ED. It's in fact up to the tax court. And all the reviewer is supposed to do, or the claimant, is to provide the information, the 5 different sections that we talked about, in order for the judge to decide whether the information shows it's SR&ED or not. So it's ultimately a legal decision that the scientist is to provide information for. It's not a scientific interpretation. Okay? So that the courts are clear that they're the ultimate authority on SR&ED, not research and technology reviewers. They focus on something called the scientific method. And I love this definition because this is how I always thought about it. When I'm coming out to a new client, I say, well, really what we're method. And what's beautiful about that is no matter where my clients are from, they all Asia or South American. Hey, you mean objective, hypothesis, analysis, results, I'll say that's exactly what we're talking about. That is a universal definition that everybody understands. Okay? And on that one, the conclusion's always at the end. It's not conclusion, objective, hypothesis. So not the way Siri asks, what's your advancement that you contemplated or that you achieved? That would be putting the conclusion up front. So again, when you ask for the advancement up front, people tend to get confused. What I'd say is the advancement's the conclusion at the end of the day, but only if you followed all the other steps. The steps would then be, ensure the definition of knowledge at the outset. Try to quantify the objectives versus your performance. Correlate the experiments to hypothesis, which again we'll say is an experiment. I hypothesized that these 5 and the other ones I could experiment with. Ensure the work was done systematically. We'll talk about what that means. And then clarify what the conclusion is in relation to the hypothesis. How do these variables relate? Was my hypothesis correct? I have the right interrelation? Or the weighting that I've given is wrong, incorrect, in which case I've still learned something. Okay, so we'll talk about the change. So, as long as a positive effect at the day, I think they're going to be good. Sorry, got that slide again. The role of the expert witness. In the case of R.S. Christie, the judge said, for the purpose of the act is a question of law, or a mixed law and fact to determine not the expert witness. An expert witness rule is limited to providing the court with a set of prescription glasses, is what the courts say, through which the technical information can be viewed by the judge to make a conclusion on whether it's SR&ED or not. So the tax court is always going to be the ultimate authority on claims. And we'll talk about some new strategies on how tax court's becoming more and more important. So some of the suggestions that they talk is in a landmark case called Northwest Hydraulics, what the judge said to determine whether there's an act is asked 5 questions. They said there's a 5-stage process, and in turn they asked 5 separate questions, which we'll look at. They say you've got to observe the matter, formulate a clear objective, identify the uncertainty, formulate a hypothesis, and then systematically test the hypothesis. So that's that scientific method that we're talking about, which when we look at it is accepted by most people all the way down the line.